Those of you I don't know, I'm Miriam Seifter. I'm a law professor here at UW, and I co-direct the State Democracy Research Initiative. This seemed too loud? Seems too loud to me, no? Mixed views, okay, all right, we'll keep going. So we are thrilled this afternoon to dig into questions about state and local finance and to learn from experts on timely issues of state and local budgets and budget crises. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to especially thank the people who made today's event possible. So thank you first to the Tommy G. Thompson Center on Public Leadership for generously co-sponsoring this event, and to the Thompson Center's director, Alex Tock, and to Ruth Brash for all of their time and help. This event would not be possible without them. I also want to thank my own SDRI colleagues who have worked on making this event a reality, including our executive director, Bree Wilde, and our program coordinator, Evan Schumacher. So thank you all so much for helping make this event possible. Without further ado, I'm excited to introduce our speakers. To my left, David Schleicher is a professor of law at Yale Law School and a nationally recognized expert in local government law, land use, federalism, state and local finance, and urban development. His work has been published widely in academic journals, including the Yale Law Journal and the University of Chicago Law Review, as well as in popular outlets like The Atlantic and Slate. He's also the host of the hit podcast, Digging a Hole, the Legal Theory podcast. Check it out. And most recently, of course, he is the author of In a Bad State, Responding to State and Local Budget Crises, which is why we are here today. David Schleicher was previously an associate professor of law at George Mason University School of Law, where he won the university's Teaching Excellence Award. He has also taught at Georgetown, Harvard, and NYU. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, the London School of Economics, and Dartmouth College. To David's left, Michael Ford is a tenured associate professor of public administration and director of the Masters of Public Administration program at the University of Wisconsin, Oshkosh. He has published extensively on public and nonprofit governance, as well as education policy. In addition to his role at UW Oshkosh, he serves as an elected member of the Oshkosh Common Council, as a member of the Oshkosh Plan Commission, on the board of Clarity Care, Inc., and as president of the Midwest Public Affairs Conference. Professor Ford also writes monthly columns for the Public Administration Times and the Oshkosh Herald, and his work has been featured in a variety of media outlets, including the Washington Post, the Houston Chronicle, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, the Associated Press, and Wisconsin Public Radio. Prior to joining academia, Professor Ford served as a research associate and vice president of operations for School Choice Wisconsin and research director for the Wisconsin Policy Research Institute. He holds degrees from Marquette University, a master's of political science from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and a PhD in urban studies from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Please join me in welcoming our speakers. So while David approaches the podium, I want to tell you just a little bit more about how today's event will run. We are approved for 1.5 CLE credits, so we will end at 4:15 p.m. That's a 1.5 CLE credit, 90 minutes for you. I'm going to hand it over to Professor Schleicher first to talk about his book. After that, Professor Ford will offer some responsive comments, including some observations about how the book's themes relate to Wisconsin. And then finally, we'll save the remaining time for audience questions, so please do be thinking about your questions, which I will moderate. And I want to emphasize that there are plenty of students in the room, and at least my students have not studied state and local budgets yet. So both of our speakers have generously agreed to make today's event as instructional and accessible as possible. So please don't hesitate to ask questions that are just of the nature of like, I would like to understand this better. Can you please explain it? And I think that's all. Oh, I think we'll have a brief reception after, so please don't miss that. You came out here on a Friday. Let us give you some snacks. And now, without further ado, I think I'll hand it over to David Schleicher.
Hey, everyone. Hello. Hello. Hey, everyone. There you go. So our political culture is so federalized that we focus on the national government so much that the basic facts about who pays for what are often somewhat obscure to us. But in fact, if you think about it for a minute, if you've ever met a government official, if you saw a government official today, it was extremely likely that it was a state and local official and not a federal official. And that would be true no matter where you are, whether you're here or elsewhere. That more than, more than 90% of overall federal officials government officials are state and local officials. And a large percentage of our overall labor force. Further, state and local governments pay for a lot of stuff. So there's an old joke that describes the federal government as a insurance company with an army. It takes taxes and it gives money to old people, and then it runs an army, and then it also is kind of a transfer agent to give money to state and local governments, but almost everything you care about from government, at least in terms of domestic policy, is directly provided by state and local governments, whether it's teaching, schools, police, fire services, whatever else it is. Indeed, even infrastructure, which is something we're going to talk about a little bit during this talk, is mostly funded through state and local governments. We talk about Infrastructure Week or the Infrastructure Bill, but especially if you take operations and maintenance into account, investment in the future is largely a state and local concern, and as it has always been in America. And so because state and local governments have always been responsible for doing most stuff that we care about, it becomes a problem if they can't pay for it. States and cities are very differently situated from the federal government in terms of their ability to pay for stuff. What happens if they can't pay for stuff? Federal government borrows money in a currency that it prints itself. So we borrow money in dollars. And so the inability to have dollars is a choice of federal policy and not something that could be forced upon the federal government. There are bad things about printing dollars to pay for debts, but like ultimately it's something that it can do if it needs to. And relatedly, the federal government has enough taxing authority to pay for anything. It's not like no matter how big the debts get, it's relatively small relative to the power of taxing, and it's not like the tax base is captive in the sense that it's very hard for people to leave the United States and get outside of New York State. The United States' taxing authority. States and cities are different in this regard, in that they can't print dollars to pay their debts, and they if they tax too much, people will leave. There's some debate about how that works, but the needless to say that we can have crises in the ability of states and cities to provide basic services. They can get too indebted and they can face big crises. And because we have thousands of local governments and 50 states, some territories, and we've had American history has lasted now a little while, there have been lots and lots of fiscal crises. And so what my book is about, available at fine newsstands everywhere, is about what happens. How should we think about state and local fiscal? What happens when a state or city, whether it's the Pennsylvania in the 1840s, or whether it's Arkansas in the 1930s, or whether it's Puerto Rico in the 2010s, territorial government, it's can't pay its debt. How should we as a polity, big we, the Americans, and particularly the federal government, think about the problem of a state and local fiscal crisis? One thing I'll note is that it kind of looking at history this way, or looking at the problem this way, or what the issues are, kind of provides a little master key to American history, because this is something we've been dealing with from the first Congress through COVID. So the first Congress, Hamilton's plan to assume state debts. I mean, any like a Hamilton the musical fans, I promise I'm not going to rap. I've done that in several ones, but it was one issue at the first Congress, and something dealing with state and local fiscal crises was a big issue in Congress a couple of years ago. And we've been dealing with this successively over time because, again, we have lots and lots of states. We have lots and lots of local governments. We rely on them a lot, and they have real limitations on their ability both to raise money and to deal with shocks. And so the question that the book attempts to tackle is, what should we do, or how should we even think about what people are doing when a state or city can't pay its debts? Again, which again, very common situation, at least for cities over time. So what should we do? How should we think about it? To the extent people have written about this before, and this is an old problem, so there's lots and lots and lots of people who've written about it before, we've kind of understood it as a dilemma. On one hand, we can do bailouts. That is to say that when a state or city faces a fiscal problem, the federal government can just give them money. And people have taken this position from Hamilton through the federal aid during COVID. And the idea here is that if a state or city is facing a real crisis, if they cut everything, it will cause huge macroeconomic displacement. You'll be cutting spending. These always happen during recessions. And so if they cut a lot of spending, then the economy will get worse. And also people will suffer because they will be depending on services, which you depend on more when the economy is bad, and we'll be taking it away from them, and that'll be bad. And so what the federal government should do is take advantage of its greater taxing authority, take advantage of its monetary authority, and just give money to jurisdictions. And again, this is one way to approach this problem. Critics of this have always been there, and they've been there again since the first Congress. And the concern they've always had has been what people call moral hazard. The idea here is, you may have encountered this when thinking about banks and this problem during the Great Recession, but the basic idea here is that if we give money to states and cities, when they're in crisis, they have no incentive to budget responsibly. They say, if you know you're going to get a bailout, whether it's from Uncle Sam or from Dad or whatever, then you have no incentive to budget responsibly. And a lot of the good things we think we might get from having a federal system are not on offer as a result, because one of the things we think that it's good to have people, getting local democracy. We might talk about the extent of it, choosing for themselves. But if in fact what they're choosing for themselves is with no downsides, then that's not really a system of the kind of federalist system we might want. And so we might be worried that if we do bailouts, we're going to get irresponsible state government budgeting going forward. And that's the way people have understood the problem, since Hamilton. But there's a problem with this as a way of understanding, or these are both valid perspectives on the problem of what we should do in the case of a crisis, and the problem in order to understand what that problem is, you have to know a little bit about debt. And I don't want to spend too much time. I mean, people are out here on Friday to talk about budgets, and I'm going to start talking about municipal bonds, and we're going to lose the whole crowd here. But one thing to say is that if you took either one of those perspectives and took an ex-ante perspective, that is, you'd say, I either think we should do bailouts, or I think we should do we should not do bailouts, or we should be concerned about bailouts. You should be very concerned about state and local borrowing. Why? Because if a jurisdiction comes into a financial crisis and is heavily indebted, it's more likely to need a bailout, whether that's good or bad in that situation, right? And so, but in fact, over the course of American history, we've been extremely pro state and local debt. That is to say, it has always been the policy of the United States that we want state and local governments to borrow. And in fact, since we've had an income tax, we've provided a direct income tax subsidy for state and local governments borrowing. So if you lend money to a state government through a municipal bond, the interest you get on that is tax exempt. You don't pay federal income taxes on it. And that's a direct state subsidy of state and local borrowing. And to states, go out and borrow more. Why would we take this position as a country? And the answer is that, again, since very early on and consistently, the federal government has proven unable to make debt-financed investments in stuff. Very early, there was a huge debate about what role Congress should play in building infrastructure. And all infrastructure bills devolved into providing lighthouses to every jurisdiction. And why is that? Well, a districted Congress, this is Barry Weingast or John Fairjohn's analysis, tends towards pork spending with respect to infrastructure. Further, you may have noticed about America, it's a very big country. And it's really hard to know if Walla Walla, Washington needs a new sewer system if you are a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. It's just hard to know. And so the combination of those two things has led to the federal government's position about infrastructure, which it is obviously very, especially early on, very in favor of there being more of, has been we need to have states and cities, local jurisdictions are going to need to provide that for us. We might subsidize it because it provides benefits across the polity, but we need to subsidize it. So we've been very, very pro-debt. How does that fit our story about what happens in a crisis? Well, one thing about if you want people to be able to borrow, because you think it's necessary for solving this massive, massive problem of a country needing infrastructure, particularly if you think back to an earlier America where we're even developing country, we desperately in need of infrastructure spending. Lenders need to be confident that they will get paid back. So in a crisis, the federal government's response has frequently been not merely to choose between bailout or not bailout, but conditional on not doing bailout. It's had a choice between making jurisdictions dig down deep and pay their debts, suffer, cut, or alternately screw their creditors. And that the reason they wouldn't just choose that default on your creditor option is because the federal government will often stop jurisdictions from doing that because they are concerned about the ability of all jurisdictions, state and local jurisdictions, to borrow. So faced with a crisis, the federal government doesn't face a dilemma, but it faces a trilemma. It has three options. All of them are bad. It's a tragic set of choices. So that if they do they want to achieve three different things. They want to avoid moral hazard. They want to avoid the economic dislocation caused by cuts during a recession, and they want to avoid harms to future ability to invest. Let's say harms to the bond market. But whatever intervention they choose, they're going to harm one of those three values. They do a bailout, avoids cuts today, avoids harms to the bond market, creates moral hazard. They force states, they've overcome sovereign immunity. They do all sorts of things to make payments really, really, really struggle. Then you'll avoid moral hazard, and you will avoid harm to the general bond market, but you'll suffer today. And relatedly, if you don't pay your creditors, or you allow or encourage a jurisdiction not to pay its creditors, then you can avoid as much economic harm right now, and you can avoid moral hazard problems, but you have this kind of out problem. So we have a trilemma. You have three choices, and they're all bad. And as a result of them all being bad, we've cycled through them over time. So in the first Congress, we were dealing with a huge overhang of Revolutionary War era debt. And the answer Hamilton came up with was to assume state debts. A pure bailout as you can imagine. This provided, as Hamilton, he didn't have the Keynesian terms to talk about it, provided stimulus and allowed states to continue borrowing, but created a huge amount of moral hazard. And this is actually an amazing little story for history buffs. So Nicholas Biddle, maybe a character you've encountered, I don't know, he's the chairman of the Bank of the United States. After the Bank of the United States was disestablished, was then the head of the Bank of Pennsylvania. And he gets on a boat to England, who are the main lenders to US states, and says, keep lending to US states. The federal government stands behind them. This is in 1839. In 1840, 8 states and a territory defaulted. And the federal government was faced, should we do bailouts again? So again, we have the moral hazard problem very, very clearly expressed, so that the states had actually, Pennsylvania and a bunch of states had gotten rid of their property taxes. They were like, well, it's in there. They took kind of a YOLO position on their budgets, and lenders took a similar, devil may care position on this. And then the question was, should we keep going with this Hamiltonian bailout program? And in the 1840s, the federal government took a different position, and they said, no, we're not going to do bailout. And states defaulted on their creditors. And this had all the expected effects. So the default on creditors really did reduce moral hazard. All states now have what we call state fiscal constitutions, debt limits, balanced budget requirements, limits on what we call public purpose requirements, a whole limits on their budgets, which were a way to avoid the moral hazard problem that they internalized themselves. Not paying back creditors allowed the avoiding some short-term economic harms, but it had the effect that states weren't really major borrowers for about 100 years after this, 80 years after this period, and we move into another period. And so states, again, we have this problem, but then they're not borrowing, and states are not making investments. In the 1870s, we have kind of dual crises. I'm not going to go through all of them, I promise. I'll stop after the 1870s. But we have dual crises. So again, a bunch of across, mostly, particularly in the Midwest and very much in Wisconsin, we're building out our railroad system. It's all subsidized by local governments. So the way to imagine America at this time, building out our railroad system, the intercontinentals were paid for by the federal government, but every other line was largely paid for by state and local governments. And you can imagine railroad operators kind of going to jurisdictions like they're selling the monorail in the episode of The Simpsons. I don't know if that works. An older crowd. No, it's good. Monorail. I keep the joke going for the 4 people who like it. No, it's and then we had a huge set of crises across the entire Midwest and really the entire country when these things defaulted. So we had the investment, some of them worked out, most of them didn't. We had a huge amount of overbuilding. And across you had about 10% of all borrowing by local governments was in default in the 1870s. What are we going to do about this problem? In roughly the same period, at the kind of a little bit kind of in the later part of this period, all the southern states default on their debt. Almost all the southern states default on their debts after Reconstruction. They decided they didn't want to pay the debts incurred by mixed race governments. And they said, and they default on their debts. And both of these sets of cases came to the Supreme Court in roughly the same period. And the Supreme Court took very different tacks on them. With respect to state and local governments, by the way, just so you have some idea about the level, for the lawyers in here, this was what the Supreme Court did for about 30 years. From 1868, from the Civil War until the High Lochner period, the Supreme Court hears about 300 cases involving municipal bonds. It was the biggest issue. Also, if you guys remember at all your civil procedure, civil procedure people, you remember like your Erie, when you talk about Swift versus Tyson, what Swift versus Tyson was as a doctrine was all these cases in practice. This is all what they did. Supreme Court just made up a huge amount of law in order to help creditors against local governments. Why did they do this? They were very explicit in what they were doing. They said, we are doing this because we want to ensure that people continue to lend. The Supreme Court was like extremely clear. They said, if we don't do this, creditors will be harmed. And jurisdictions were very unhappy about this. But at the same time, they invented modern sovereign immunity doctrines. So sovereign immunity, again, small, an even smaller crowd than the lawyers here who took Civ Pro, are lawyers who were like really excited about talking about Fed courts. But they invented a doctrine that protected states from suit. Their previous sets of rules had not worked that way. And they did so to protect states against their creditors. Well, what were the effects of these two interventions? Well, we see in the period after the Supreme Court intervenes on behalf of creditors against cities, cities suffer enormous fiscal harms. So you see economic depression throughout large portions of the country. On the other hand, you see a preservation of the municipal bond industry. And we see in the period afterwards, huge amount of lending to create the glory period of American infrastructure. The Brooklyn Bridge, the raising of the city of Chicago, the reversal of the Chicago River. At the same time, you see in the South a reduction in the economic harms associated with that they would have had they need to pay their debts. On the other, which was kind of part of the kind of broader deal associated with the end of Reconstruction. On the other hand, no one would lend money to the South. So the jurisdictions in the South. So in the and you've ever wondered why all the infrastructure, if you're in the North, it seems so old, and all the infrastructure in the South seems, well, it was because it was all built much later, because they weren't building anything. And so in the broad stories about what causes economic growth and decline, this plays a role. But I have one quick aside on the infrastructure boom of involving municipal governments. There's a line from the one historian, John Tieford, where he says, the city of Chicago declared that the city shall be raised, and it was raised. It declared that the river should run in the opposite direction, and it was, and it did. The city of Chicago was had powers like that of the Old Testament God. Well, why did they have those powers? The municipal bond market. We could go through there. I could go through the 20th century too. There are a lot of great stories involved in this. The New York City fiscal crisis, the Great Depression, all sorts of stories. But this basic pattern repeats and repeats, despite huge amounts of other things changing in the relationship between federal government and state government. Even recently, we had when COVID hit. It looked like we're going to have huge amounts of state and local defaults. The head of the state Senate of Illinois went to Congress and said, the state needs a $40 billion bailout. Probably too small, they thought. And we dealt with the same issue and the same type of problems very recently. So I don't have that much longer. So I just want to quickly go on to so what should we do? This is what we've done. What should we do? So if we face a situation and you look in the newspaper tomorrow and it says Chicago, bankrupt, Illinois, bankrupt, what attitude should you sitting in Wisconsin have towards that question, other than saying, like, suckers? I don't know. What attitude should you have towards that question? How would we, if a federal official proposed some proposal to solve this? Again, this isn't ancient history. This is something that you read about in the newspapers relatively recently. Hopefully, read in the newspapers. What should they do? It turns out that there's no one answer to that. Again, remember, it's all bad choices. So all choices are bad. We could offer bailouts. In fact, that's what we provided a record amount of state and local aid during COVID, and that created real benefits. It probably gave so much that it probably may have overstimulated the economy. It avoided reductions in state and local borrowing. On the other hand, it's pretty likely seemed to have created moral hazard. And I could talk about the evidence for that. On the other, we could have done other things and they would have had other related upsides and downsides. There's no one answer to this question of what we should do if Illinois and Chicago, the book starts with a description of Illinois and Chicago are bankrupt, what should we do? And it kind of proposes some options. Instead, what I think we should think about is not whether bailouts, defaults, or austerity are the right answer to all problems. The situation will depend over time. We'll have these crises and they'll be different into different macroeconomic conditions, into different social conditions. But instead, think a little bit about what values we want to encode in whatever responses we do offer. And so I offer a couple of principles for thinking about this problem. And so say that whatever response we take, whether it's a system of bailouts, a system of defaults, or a system of austerity, we should encode into that response some things that make crises less likely in the future. And so here are the ideas that I offer. First one is like we should encourage prudence. That the federal government, when it offers either aid or kind of aids in defaulting, should encourage jurisdictions to be more fiscally responsible next time. Again, we have, jurisdictions are very different in their responses. So Utah has a AAA rating. It's like as well run as you could be. In other states, not so much. And we might try to say, how could we encourage jurisdictions to be more responsible going forward? And so one thing you might imagine is the federal government could use conditional spending to encourage states to adopt better budgeting practices. So states generally budget on what's called a cash basis, which is like how much money do we get in now versus how much money do we pay, and don't take into consideration the accrual of debts. If you make a promise now that's going to have an effect in the future, and this is one of the reasons why that's how state balanced budget rules work, why pension underfunding is such an attractive option for jurisdictions. So many jurisdictions underfund their public pensions, and you say, well, this is because workers are getting such a good deal or whatever. And it turns out that largely it's because our state constitutional rules privilege it. That's to say, it is a way you can say you have a balanced budget, but not actually. So we could make conditional spending that is conditional on states adopting better budget rules. And I could talk about other ways we could encode prudence into our system and how you might overcome some legal challenges with that. You might think about what I call spreading the harms. So any jurisdiction's cuts, it'll probably be if one jurisdiction is forced to face cuts, it will be really bad. But if you could spread it across a number of jurisdictions, it might be a little less bad. So when most of us are governed by many, many governments all at once, a city, a county, a school district, any number of special districts, and to the extent we can build in tools that allow for all of them to face cuts at the same time, the cost of those cuts will be less bad. So here's an example. When Detroit went bankrupt, the Detroit school district was largely bailed out by the state. Detroit School District has the exact same boundaries as the city, but it's formally a separate government. So as a result, like police officers' pensions took a hit, but teacher pensions didn't take a hit. Not only is that unfair, they took a bigger hit as a result, and further lending to the city was lenders were hurt more, and lenders to the school district were hurt less. And that's the result is that the harms were bigger to the people who had to bear harms. And so I argue we have a system for legal system for dealing with municipal, not just state bankruptcy, not states, but for local governments that go into bankruptcy. And we could build a system that allows many of them to go into bankruptcy at the same time. And in fact, systems that would encourage all of the related governments to go into bankruptcy at the same time, rather than doing a system that treats them all, each one individually. In fact, we could also, as my friend David Schleicher proposed, create a system of allow states to use this legal tool for bankruptcy to kind of spread the harms more broadly. We also can think about tools that would balance across each of these harms. So while we have to make this choice between this trilemma, we might imagine that we could do a little bit along each dimension rather than all on one dimension. So let me give an example of what I'm talking about. When the federal government ended, so there's a famous, again, I would keep saying famous, like this is like Taylor Swift famous, but like it's like, famous-ish. A headline maybe in the Daily News in the 1970s that when federal government, New York City was going on the verge of defaulting, and it asked the federal government for money, and the headline said, "Ford to city, drop dead." This is the second most famous headline in the history of New York City tabloids. The most famous is "Headless Body in the Topless Bar." So it's not quite as dramatic as that, but pretty good. Ford to City drop dead. Miriam's looking at me like I'm crazy. No, it's good. What happened in the end was that the federal government did provide aid to New York City through something called the Seasonal Financing Act, but it did so after New York City had engaged in really drastic fiscal cuts and, in fact, impaired creditors somewhat. And so the idea here is that we can do a little bit across a variety. And again, if you imagine doing all on one dimension is going to be worse than doing a little bit on each dimension, there are reasons to think that would be the case. We might imagine doing it that way. I want to close by saying, what else can we do? So this is all about what the federal government can do. And the basic problem, when the federal government faces a state and local fiscal crisis, it's going to have bad options. So again, when we saw the federal government need to deal with state and local fiscal problems during COVID, there weren't a lot of good options. People were really angry. And the choices were all bad. They were all costly. But again, it didn't happen equally across all jurisdictions. And the question we can ask is, how can we as citizens encourage state and local governments to be a little less spendthrift? Again, they vary. How can we encourage them to be better? And this hits something that I think the center here is been focused on quite a lot, which is how to make state democracy work a little better. It turns out, by the way, that state democracy is working really, really, really badly, and there aren't a lot of incentives for state and local governments, even independent from these questions of bailout, to be responsible. And why is that? Well, it turns out that across almost all situations, people don't know anything about state government. That is to say, if you ask people who their state senator is, you usually get a huge number of blank stares. If you ask people jurisdiction, that fewer than 50% of people can tell you which party controls the state legislature. Turns out voting for state legislature is about 95% correlated with voting for president. People in most situations, in most of the time, again, Wisconsin may be a slight exception to this, but it's in most situations, most of the time, nothing that happens in a state legislature has any effect on a state election. People vote for president and or whatever party they vote for president, and they just mindlessly go down the ballot, and whatever the state is doing has almost no effect on it. Governor elections are a little different from this, but for the most part, and the thing we should ask ourselves about state and local fiscal crises, in addition to what should the federal government do in a crisis, is how can we as citizens make our state and local democracy work a little better, such that states are less likely to get in a jam. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yeah, my dad taught me to never turn down a beer and a podium. I wish I had a beer here, but I don't. I wish I had them together, but no, yeah, you get a podium, you should use it. So thank you, David. Those are really, really interesting points. And I'm glad you brought up that last point in particular about the importance of good governance. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, I run a research center called the Whitburn Center for Governance and Policy Research at UW Oshkosh. And that's our tagline. We want to prove that we can still govern here in the state of Wisconsin. I think we're showing that we can, but every time I think we're having some progress, there's a headline that says exactly the opposite. But you can just go a few blocks over there if you want to figure that out. So like I said, thank you so much for having me. I'll go into some specifics, reactions to what David had to say. I was asked to talk about, how this stuff relates to Wisconsin and more focused on state and local. And certainly that is my background. But I also want to start by saying, talking a little bit about what I see as the universal budgeting challenge, so we can really understand what local and state policymakers are facing when they get into the budgeting process. And its resources are finite, needs are infinite, and values are contested. So right off the bat, we're kind of set up to fail. So what do we mean by resources are finite? Well, we're never going to have enough. We're never going to have enough resources out there. We're always going to be at the end of that budgetary cycle, whether it's Joint Finance Committee over in the state capitol, or whether it's the local budgeting process like municipalities like mine are doing. We're always going to be at the end of that process and thinking, well, do we have 2 police or do we have 2 more folks in public works? We don't have enough for all 4 of them. Doesn't mean not all 4 of them are needed and they're not all good things. We're just not going to have enough. Our needs are infinite. We're never going to be able to accomplish everything that we want to as an elected official, as an administrator for a municipality, as a state legislator, as a department head. So we're always going to be a little bit disappointed. And adding kind of insult to injury there, values are contested. This is where the political process comes in. Wisconsin's ground zero for this because we're such a 50-50 state. As was mentioned, I serve on the city council in Oshkosh, which is a city of 68,000 people. That's like a 50-50 state. So no matter what we do, or 50-50 city, excuse me, no matter what we do, people are going to be upset. Half the people are going to be upset. I'm a runner and I've noticed this. I've had to change my routes every couple of years because I have neighbors. Ruth is one of them. I hope she's not watching this right now, but there's a pothole or if I made a bad decision, she's going to let me know. And she's going to yell at, even no matter if my headphones are really, really loud. But so it sounds like I'm painting a really grim picture, but I really don't think I am painting a grim picture because I think that the budget is the point or the place where we can show that we can still govern, where we can work out all of these contradictions in our nation and in our day-to-day operations of government. So I always say that budgets are romantic to my students, and a lot of them drop the course immediately. No, I have 40 budgeting students right now, and I led with that, and they're kind of skeptical looking at me, but it's the contract between the government and the governed. It is that document that is the plan. It's where we as a government are telling our residents, this is what our plan is going to be. You can vote for me or not vote for me, and you're going to be telling me whether or not this is legitimate. It's an accountability mechanism. It's a way of saying at the end of that budget cycle, here's what we said we were going to do. Here are the key performance indicators that are baked into our budget, and you can judge us by this. So when you get it right, it's really an opportunity to build trust in government and bridge some of those divides that we have in our state, in our communities. So when I say that budgets are romantic, I mean the whole part of it, the process of it, by which we sort out all these contradictions, the politics of it, but then the document itself, the quality of a budget document, how useful is it? There's still municipalities where I want to meet these people. They have problems, in my opinion, where they print out the budget document and then they rescan it back in as a PDF and they post some monstrous unsearchable document on their webpage. Like, what are you doing? That is the opposite of transparency. So I like to talk about proactive transparency versus passive transparency, right? We have things on the books. There's pieces of information. You go to the Department of Revenue and you can find it for every municipality in Wisconsin. There's pieces of information that have to be in a budget. There's things we have to do. If someone calls and makes an information request, we have to release things. But being proactive means, are we taking the extra step, making that document searchable, making that document useful to individuals working in the municipality and for residents? Are we looking at it like an onion, where there's going to be some people that just care, how much do we spend on police? But there's going to be some people that care, how much are we spending on police radios? And we want to have a document that's really easy to navigate and get to those specifics so we can really dig into what we're doing. And I think that builds trust. It's so much more disarming when someone has a question about spending in a state or a municipality, and you can just show them, right? Yeah, we have it on our website in real time. We have a data visualization. We're presenting it in different ways. So even an 8th grader can make sense of it. I was lucky. I had an 8th grader who was my focus group, and I would show him budgeting stuff and said, can you make sense of this? Now he's a freshman in high school, so I should probably change my advice that, if a 14-year-old can understand it, that means it's good. But the point is, we're thinking about this. We're thinking about who's actually going to use this document. It's not just a bureaucratic requirement. Okay, so let's get closer to Wisconsin here. What are the big budgetary issues facing state and local government in Wisconsin? And I think it begins with the nature of that state and local relationship, that federalism. We've come through a really weird 2 decades. And I don't know, do we have any local government people in here? People that work for a local government? No? All right. Well, that's too bad. Maybe you will when you're inspired by this speech, right? Future local government people, that's good. And I'll have a piece of advice for you at the end. But we had this really weird 2 decades when it came to budgeting, where the state was taking austerity measures and amassing this large surplus. And we know it's, every day we seem to get a different number, but somewhere around $7 billion. So a large state surplus. But at the same time, local governments were having their aid frozen and cut a couple times. We had levy limits that would limit the amount of money that local governments could bring in, and this giant shift to the property tax. So you had these austerity measures that they definitely worked at the state level. But if you're like me, I pay my state and local taxes. No, you probably do too. If the total fiscal burden on the taxpayer is just being moved around, I don't really know what you're accomplishing by those austerity measures. And I think it's a consequence that we just weren't working together. There was not a true partnership there. Now, that said, we've made some changes recently. If you follow the recent shared revenue bill that was bipartisan, so passed the Republican-controlled legislature, signed by Democratic Governor Tony Evers, it did increase that municipal aid that had been frozen since 1994. I usually make a Pearl Jam joke or a reference here, but the Simpsons joke went over like, like this isn't the crowd for 1990s jokes. But that really was the dominant value in municipal aid in Wisconsin up until last year, that, yeah, whatever you were doing in 1994 was great. So let's keep building off of that. But finally, we tore that down. We're having a 20% increase in shared revenue. So that's just municipal aid from the state government that's being collected from your income taxes and sales tax and being transferred to local governments for all kinds of different purposes. That finally went up. But more importantly, future increases are tied to increased state sales tax collections. The concept being that, hey, when the state economy is doing well, local governments ought to benefit too. If the economy is not doing well, talk about that moral hazard, like we ought to share in the pain too. So I think there's some logical structure that's been built into it. And really, I bring this up because it was a very significant piece of legislation, but I also think making this piece of legislation work and making sure that it's the building block to restoring that state-local partnership, that's going to be a dominant budgeting thing over the next 2 or 3 years in the local level. The second thing is continues to be COVID relief. I did a big paper about COVID and I was presenting it all over the state last September, and then I caught COVID while I was presenting it. So I found that to be ironic, but I also found it to be on the minds of our local government folks. And I mean, quite a few different things. We talked about ARPA, so the municipal or the federal aid that was flowing to local governments. Some local governments, I think, were very responsible. They had specific policies that they created locally to make sure that they weren't creating new programming or ongoing costs, because these are one-time funds and you don't want to have a long-term cost that you're spending on your credit card. But some local governments weren't. And they're going to have a rude awakening where they use their COVID relief funds to plug temporary budget gaps, often through moving money around. So you can still say you used it for your intended purpose, but really you just shifted it. And they're going to be in for a rude awakening when these funds stop coming, because they'll have a structural deficit, meaning right, their revenues are not going to be enough to cover their expenditures, and they're going to have to find those funds from somewhere else. Related to that, we're in an era of inflation that I think, as was alluded to by David, you could connect that to some of this relief fund, and certainly connect that to COVID. And that's been double or triple whammy. I'll let you know when I'm done explaining it. But things are getting more expensive, right? Here in Oshkosh, we have a $3 million parks building that costs $6 million. If you ever want to see something like that, I recommend you come see it. But every project like that, we put these in the CIP in our 10-year spending plans, and we earmark a certain amount of funds for it. And we make these long-term decisions based on it. But inflation hit, material costs go up. Suddenly we have to make decisions. And this is every local government in the state. Are we going to not do this project? Are we going to delay it? Are we going to move it into debt? If we move it into debt, does that mean that we're going to be paying higher interest rates on it? And related to that, one of these secret revenue sources for local governments over the past 5 or 10 years has been debt refinancing. I mean, that's been a significant revenue stream that local governments have done, just like any of you with mortgages might do. You have a 6% interest rates go down to 3%. What do? You refinance, you free up some money, lower your monthly payment. Local government was doing that, and many a local government in Wisconsin was doing that to help balance their budget. But now that interest rates are high again, that's going to be an option that's off the table. Interest rates are high, you can't refinance. And that's a rude awakening that a lot of local governments are facing right now. Now, going more specifically to what David had to say about fiscal crises, your comments really got me thinking about early in my career when I was working in Milwaukee, and everyone wanted to know the Milwaukee Public Schools. When do they fall off the cliff? When do they fall off the cliff, like the fiscal cliff? Because they're a school district that's built for 120,000 kids with 80,000 kids. When is it going to happen? And it doesn't happen in most times. Most fiscal crises are not Detroit. They're not these extreme cases where you're actually fiscally insolvent. It's a gradual degradation, right? It's like my eyesight. I don't just go blind one day. I'm slowly. If you follow my Facebook algorithm, I advertise like as if I'm a man in deep physical decline. Maybe some of you can sympathize with that. But the same thing happens with finances. Right? It's not like, okay, we lost 10,000 people in a city. It's not just like one block all got together, a neighborhood just left, right? You still have those fixed costs. So you see a gradual degradation in services, and you're making decisions. Are we going to cut some things? Are we going to raise our property tax? And by the way, there's going to be limits on what we can actually do in terms of raising property tax, but we get stuck in this vicious cycle. And creates all these perverse incentives where we're trying to balance our 1-year budget. And we might do it through refinancing our debt. We might do it through our ARPA funds. But at the end of the day, we're not looking long-term. So yeah, budgeting is so important from a short-term process, that 1 year or a 2-year budget if it's the state level, but it's really a long-term thing. Most of your costs, most of your services, they're cumulative. So it's really hard to deal with this slow degradation. To talk a little bit about moral hazard, as David was going into, here in Wisconsin, at least, the impulse has been preemption and fiscal controls. And why that may be well-meaning, I would say local government is very creative and very reactive. So going back to the example of like revenue limits, if people know what revenue limits are, it basically just says local government can only raise so much more money annually via the property tax. That's the simplest way to explain it. So that the state limits what you can bring in terms of revenue, but there's rules attached to that. And local government's really good at getting around those rules. Some of the things that people have been doing is creating new utilities, like transit utilities, things that you wouldn't traditionally look at as a utility, but something that's not explicitly banned by the state of Wisconsin, but is a potential revenue source. You have things like the county sales tax that's been allowed to happen for a few decades, but over the last couple of years, we've gotten to the point where 68 out of 72 counties have adopted this sales tax as a revenue source. Similarly, things like the wheel tax. These are options that were always on the books, but very few municipalities took them. The last 2 decades, people are adopting them left and right. They're desperate for revenue sources. We've also seen human resources playing games, moving positions away from general operations to utility funded positions, because there's fewer limits on utility revenues coming in. So that'd be like, you're paying your water bill. So suddenly a municipality might say, we're not going to support our engineers on the regular property tax levy. We're going to move some of them over here to this utility because we can raise more money that way. And there's not as many rules to it. So it's moving positions around, and it's increasing the overall fiscal burden on a local property taxpayer, but it's skirting around those state rules. Same deal with tax incremental financing. If you don't know tax incremental financing, it's probably the most used tool for economic development at the local level, where you're essentially borrowing, taking out debt against future tax revenues to be generated by new development to improve that property. And tax incremental financing, the levy that's paying for those, so in other words, the money being raised to pay off that loan, was allowed to exist outside of revenue limits. So there was a huge incentive over the past 10, 15, 20 years for more and more economic development, tax incremental financing. So that's how you can create a situation where the state is trying to do austerity, saying that, hey, we're going to limit the amount of money you can bring into your local government, but local government's being creative and finding a way around it. It's a game of whack-a-mole. And I share this not because I'm saying this is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm saying this is a reality. And this ties into my conclusion here, why it's so important to have a functioning federalism in Wisconsin, where state and local government are working together in common purpose. So we're not undermining each other's actions. And getting there means, one, having a true representation of the overall fiscal burden placed on taxpayers. So we don't have this weird situation where the state is saying, hey, we cut your income tax this amount. Meanwhile, you have less money in your pocket because it just shifted to your local property tax. Right? We have to do some more work around transparency and making sure that we're communicating that in a common way. We also need to make sure that we continue to have these shared incentives for local and state government to be moving in the same direction. So I mentioned that very specific example about the state sales tax being the driver of what local government aid is in the future. I think that's really important because it allows state and local government to align their economic activities, and I'm hoping leads to more formal structures where there is that cooperation between state and local government. Because if we don't do that, and if we don't start having that really healthy federalism, we're going to do exactly, remake the same mistakes we made over the past 20, 30 years, where state and local government are almost working against one another. And it's the average Wisconsinite that's being penalized by that. And I'll finalize here because maybe I took up more than 10 minutes. No, all right. Well, how many students are in here? See, this is the one thing you should take away if you hated the rest of the lecture. If you don't read budgets, you should totally read budgets. If you're going to be working for a municipality, or if you ever have a job where you're working, with a municipality as a client, what have you, it's a way to be the smartest person in the room, even if you're not really the smartest person in the room. Because if you can understand a budget, you know where the money's coming from, you know where the money's going. And I have found in a job interview, it's incredibly lot of confidence building when you can go in there and know exactly how much the person makes that's interviewing you, and you can talk intelligently about what's going on. So yeah, if you can understand where the money's coming from, where the money's going, not only do you have a good understanding of the culture of that community, you have a good understanding of the culture of that organization. So with that, we can turn it over to Q&A.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So we have plenty of time. So I want to make, I think, 2 quick announcements, and then I actually want to take the moderator's prerogative and ask each of our speakers 1 question before we turn it over to audience questions. My announcements are, I believe we have about 20 copies of Professor Schleicher's book available, possibly even with an offer to sign them. So if you're sticking around afterwards and would like a book, please come up and we can take care of that. And the other one is, for those of you who would like CLE credit, which I recognize is not most of you, but there is a sign-in sheet. So if you missed it on the way in, please sign in for CLE credit. Okay, so my first question, I think, will be for Michael, if that's okay. And it's a question that I think we would all benefit from, especially given your comments about kind of affirmatively making budgeting transparent and accessible. Could you actually just talk us through, certainly at the local level where you operate, but maybe a little bit at the state level too, the budget process? Like, where does it begin? Who gets heard from? What are the opportunities for input, and how does it get finalized? And you know, along the way, feel free to also opine on how could that be run better?
Yeah, I mean, the first step in the budgeting process is working off of the base. So I always say that that's a bureaucratic reality. Makes logical sense because your biggest expenses in local and state government are people and stuff. It's not like you're renting people for a year or you're renting a fire engine for a year. So generally you're starting with the base, and then it's a really bureaucratic process where all your department heads, or if you're at the state level, all your, I guess they're department heads too, you know, secretaries of administration, et cetera, corrections, et cetera, where they're all kind of getting their wish list together and giving it to the chief executive. So it really is an executive dominated process, whether that's a city manager, an elected mayor, or the governor, and they're giving out some kind of directives. They usually will put out some type of general guidance to the department heads, like, hey, we're expecting 2% across the board cuts. And generally those types of advice are followed. The one big exception at the state level is the Department of Public Instruction, because that's an elected position. It also happens to be the biggest chunk of the state budget. So they can kind of, especially if the governor and the secretary of DPI are at loggerheads, they will generally not follow each other's instructions. But anyways, starts like that, where instructions are given. And then you move to the legislative phase, where it's either going to be a city council or the Joint Committee on Finance that's doing a series of workshops and really asking, asking questions. So elected officials are asking questions of your department heads, of your manager, and trying to make sense of this budget. And then eventually you get to that legislative phase, or you finish that legislative phase, and you start voting on it. And right at the state level, the governor has to sign it, or in this state can do weird things to it, like create that. I don't know if you follow that state, the education funding, which I was running the math on that. Like, they're screwing themselves. In 400 years, they'd have a lot more money if we just allowed inflation instead of $400 a year increase, like millions of dollars on the table. But I'm talking about the line item veto, where in Wisconsin, the governor can cross out little pieces of the budget. But very much an administrative bureaucratic process. And you notice I didn't mention the public, and I should, but maybe this is too cynical of me. But every time I've attended one of these public budget hearings at the state level or the road shows, they're not really that substantive. So I think we could probably do a much better job, to get to your opining, of trying to involve the community in the budgetary process. And that's where things like community surveys and listening sessions at the local level can come in.
So I was struck by almost the opposite of that when we were talking about like the need for radical transparency with the budget, as if that you could search for the number of radios that someone was doing. And it turns out that no one does. It's not because you're not reaching out, it's because it's hard to understand what's happening. In fact, I think realistically, if we're caring about a transparency budget, we need to think about the way it is accessible to information intermediaries, particularly markets or newspapers, rather than people. The idea that anyone's going to go and look through the state budget like a normal person who has a job and a life kids or whatever is going to be like searching through. It's like it's faintly ridiculous. I mean, I just like so earnest in the Midwest.
I told you I was a hopeless romantic around budgeting.
But I mean, there's recently a really interesting bit of legislation that Congress passed called the Financial Data Transparency Act that required jurisdiction. So budgeting is what you do at the front end, and then you produce accounting statements afterwards. And they produce accounting statements in traditionally in like again in PDFs that no one could read, or in like chicken scrawl or whatever it was that they produced them in, and the Congress passed the law that said you have to make them machine readable, so they're comparable across jurisdictions. And jurisdictions, including many jurisdictions in Wisconsin, howled at this federal imposition of authority that you're making jurisdictions publish things in Excel or whatever. But I think realistically, the better way to think about this is that this is democracy promoting at the local level. That is to say that it is someone at least is watching what's happening, because we can't count on individuals, or maybe it's accountability enforcing rather than democracy enforcing. In that realistically, the biggest forces for ensuring a lack of waste are going to be the bond market or newspapers rather than people. And of course, newspapers are declining. And they're related, by the way. Quick fun fact. Whenever a newspaper goes out of business, the borrowing costs of the jurisdiction in which it is skyrocket. So if your town newspaper goes out of business, you will pay more in taxes to pay for funds, because if you're lending to that kind of jurisdiction, you will know who's going to stop anyone from stealing here. Who's going to know? A related thing that's kind of fun about that is that when the state capital is far away from the biggest newspaper in the state, you have a huge spike in public corruption. So that you see evidence of people going to Albany, New York. It's like New York Times ran a story that said it has been several years since the state legislature has gone to jail for corruption. And several years was like 3. It wasn't even like, and it's why they're like, what reporter wants to go to Albany, New York? It's really far away, and it's like it's cold and it's hard to get to, and there's no trains or subways or restaurants or whatever. and so it's a drag. And so this is but again, I think that when thinking about the accountability of the government in this context, one thing to look at would be is the bond market. Again, you're a romantic about that. I'm being a romantic about the municipal bond market. That's even sadder, I think. But I think it is cooler to be romantic about newspapers, and so that's at least more common.
Okay, you have partly answered the question I was going to ask you. So I do want to take some audience questions. So I'm going to circle back to the rest of my question, which was about sort of the connection between fiscal crises and state level democracy. But I'm going to bracket that so we make sure we get some audience questions. So let me open it up. Who has questions for our speakers? Ben?
Thank you both very much for joining forward. And I think I'm from Milwaukee. The fight over shared government here with all going to be super politicized. I'm wondering if there have been similar fights across the country with big cities and state legislatures, and if there are any takeaways from
So have there ever been? There have never not been. There's to New York, which is George Washington Plunkett, who was the kind of machine politician called the Bard of Tammany Hall, once described, he said, New York City is pie for the hayseeds. And what do you mean by that? He meant that it was a huge fight over whether the relative responsibility of New York City to pay for state stuff at the state level and vice versa. So the basic story of state preemption of local authority and state budgetary, we've talked about preemption. I mean, we have a national politics about that, where we have fights between largely liberal cities and conservative state legislatures that we have in many jurisdictions, often about regulatory issues or social issues of a variety of types. But the same thing's true for budgets everywhere, which is that in general, one way to think about state budgets is that most people who live in everywhere are suburban. Cities have traditionally been big losers in state budgets and have always been. Now, Wisconsin's a little different than some jurisdictions in that its big cities are much poorer relative to the rest of the state than you see in many other states. So you don't have, and so you see that in some Midwestern states, but it's not, you don't have the phenomenon of the pie for the hayseeds phenomenon. But the basic story of state politics largely being about conflicts between city and rural or city and suburb has been an American phenomenon forever. You know,
Yeah, I'll just add to it. I mean, there's a very practical reason that happens too, and it's the sheer amount. I mean, right, if you're sending shared revenue to every municipality in the state, yeah, we might have 191 cities and villages, but Milwaukee's the elephant in the room. So if you're trying to do a bill that's going to affect everybody spending wise, you know, the biggest city, the biggest chunk of that money is going to suck up most of the attention.
Nelson?
This is a question for whoever, Professor Seifter. How do local governments get into debt? Like, I mean, and I'm sure there are multiple avenues that happen, but I'm just wondering from a practical level, is it misplanning? Do you think you're gonna have this much revenue coming in and spend accordingly, and then it's not, or people moving, or some combination of all these things? How does that happen?
no, that is not a mistake. It's a goal. So local jurisdictions borrow to build school buildings or roads, local roads, or all sorts of things. We encourage it. We think it's good. Borrowing is normal and good because, again, local jurisdictions are doing most of, and state and local are doing most of building of stuff. And so just like you borrow to buy your house or to buy a house, we generally borrow to build infrastructure. We think it makes sense to finance something that's going to have a useful life of 30 years over the course of 30 years. And the way you do that is by borrowing and then paying back over time. Relatedly, jurisdictions can borrow in all sorts of that's generally limited by state constitutions. You often have to vote for it. So some of you may have gone to vote and do you vote for a $10 million bond to build a local pool or whatever? And that's again a very normal part of American local life. There are other ways. So most jurisdictions provide defined benefit pensions for workers, but the requirement to put money in is usually not enforced by anyone. So if you're defined benefit, you promise you're going to pay someone's after they retire a fixed amount for a number of years. Well, you have to save money in order to do that. Jurisdictions come up with all sorts of ways not to save enough. They often assume very high returns on investments. They say we're going to get 8% on all of our investments forever. But jurisdictions have all sorts of ways. But jurisdictions even have more creative ways to borrow than that. So one of my favorite, the state of Arizona sold the state house and then rented it back over 30 years. They did a kind of rent a sale and lease back arrangement for the state capital. And why did they do this? Well, they wanted money this year. They wanted to borrow going forward. They couldn't use formal bonds. And so they engaged in a sale and leaseback of the state capital. We do stuff like that all the time. It happens here. One of the cases in the local government is about a town in Wisconsin doing it. So jurisdictions can borrow all the time. Borrowing isn't bad.
But maybe a way to understand the question is, how does borrowing go wrong? Like, you have expected debt, but how do you what causes these crises?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say a couple of things. First off, in Wisconsin, the state constitution limits your general obligation debt to 5% of your assessed value, because the idea is you're borrowing against the capacity of your property taxpayers to pay that back. So there's limits on that. So at any given time, the general measure we use in Wisconsin is what percentage of your debt capacity have you used? Most places on average are somewhere around 40-50%, which is probably fairly healthy. But kind of like if you have a credit card, you start, having less and less room between your allowable limit and your actual debt. Your rates are going to go up. Your budget rating is going to go down. All your debt's going to get more expensive. So I think the way people get in trouble is that they do start having, borrowing more and more at higher rates as that debt capacity goes down, and they're not thinking long term. And I think it is a matter of tracking. So when I talk about transparency, one of the things that needs to happen, in my opinion, is moving the conversation from, we really care about our annual budgets, but we need to have access to trend data and a comprehensive triangulated look at financial health that includes looking at debt and really the health of your debt. TIF districts, I mentioned TIF districts, and I really wanted to put everyone to sleep with that discussion, but that is one way where local government will take out a loan for some project they think is going to work out. If anyone's here from Cudahy, if you remember the old ice port, that was going to be a really fun ice rink, and it never got built, but the loan sure went through. So in other words, they borrowed for it, but never got the tax revenue. So that's, I think, one real specific way municipalities get in trouble.
I'll add two things to this really quickly about the kind of broader question of how you get in trouble. There's one is the ordinary set of incentives facing a politician, which are to say that every politician likes spending and doesn't like taxing, and borrowing is a way to not tax today. And so that's and another one is that sometimes economic conditions just shift. It has nothing to do with the jurisdiction. And so cities when Detroit's decline as a city, which again, Georgia's a famous example of a city that goes bankrupt, is not largely because the government did anything. It's largely because of trends in the auto industry. Now, the government did many things that created incentives for the government to do crazy things, and they did a number of completely bizarre things, from the people mover to maybe the silliest bond issue of all time, which I could talk about if you're interested. But it's sometimes just the ground shifts out from under you. You're expecting one thing and you get another, and you could end up largely in debt for those. So there are a whole variety of ways you can get in trouble.
Yeah, right there.
Yeah, my question is for Professor Ford, and your point about state and local governments creating structural problems with the COVID funds. At Chicago Public School, there was a big controversy over how determined they were to avoid fiscal cliffs, and that they were only making one-time expenditure like tutors, after-school programs, education technology, when a lot of people felt that teachers and counselors were affected. So how can the federal and state and local governments account for the fact that at some point, if you're only going to make one-time expenditures, you're going to have to choose inefficient or even ineffective options? Yeah,
that's a really good question. I mean, I always like the idea of giving, it is preemption, but you're putting strings attached to it. I think if you were to offer local governments, and as part of the ARPA, which was the federal COVID relief funds, if you were to put rules on there, really simple rules that, hey, we want to make sure you're funding this much in infrastructure, things that were previously scored in your capital improvements plan. In other words, they've already been vetted. Want to make sure that you can justify that you don't have long-term operating expenses being created by this. Now, of course, that you do that at the state level and the federal level, you have to make the assumption that local government's going to be honest and not try to work around the system, and they absolutely might. But I do think that there is a happy medium between kind of unrealistic preemption and maybe putting bounds on what you can do with these funds, where you could continue to have some local control, but still prevent those worst case scenarios.
Yeah, I guess what I'd say about that also is that the evidence that jurisdictions can't get around the rules on switching between one time, it's somewhat implausible, honestly. That Chicago Public Schools has all sorts of one-time expenditures that it faces every given year that it could shift the aid into, and then shift other monies into permanent. Now that will create problems for it going forward. It's to be discouraged in a lot of ways, I think. But the extent that it's that we put efforts to say, I think that was mostly a way of encourage that complaint mostly took the form of, we'd rather not have to hire the lawyers, engage in the chicanery in order to do what we're going to do anyway.
Yes.
Who buys these bonds?
You do. Realistically, who buys municipal bonds? It's a really great question. They are extremely widely owned. Though interestingly, because of the way the tax exemption works, they're largely owned by individuals. So let me quickly back this out. If you buy a municipal bond, the money isn't taxable against your incomes. And so if you are a tax exempt investor, like a pension fund, certain pension funds, or all sorts of things, then foreign, you're not American, then there's no incentive to buy them because they're being priced in a way to make them attractive to people who are going to get this benefit of not having to pay income taxes on things. So who gets the most benefit from that? Rich individuals. Why? Because if you're paying income at the top rate, then the income, the fact that it's exempt from income is more valuable to you than it would be otherwise. This leads to a really big debate we've had in the 2008, in the post 2008, the stimulus bill. They created something called Build America bonds, and this was a different way of funding local infrastructure. And the idea was, rather than selling bonds and then giving an interest exemption, we sold bonds that were fully taxable, but then we gave governments a wad of cash. And the idea of that was that would broaden the market for purchasing bonds, so that it wasn't just people who would be getting the big tax exemption from doing so. Further, the idea was that it was more efficient. And this requires even a little more backing out, but I'll do it because, well, I'm going to. if a municipal bond is sold with an interest exemption and it's not all bought by the richest Americans, so the people paying the top income tax rates, then it is definitionally an inefficient way of funding local government. Because if you're pricing it in a way to make it attractive to someone who's not getting that full tax exemption, then all the people who are getting that full tax exemption are getting a windfall, right? So if I'm selling it at an interest rate that will make it attractive to someone who's not paying the top rate, then I'm paying more in interest. But the people who are getting the full exemption are getting the higher interest rate, but similarly not paying the income tax exemption. And so Build America bonds were designed to avoid this. And so they had real successes. They are almost surely a more efficient mechanism for funding state and local infrastructure investment because they can be bought by anyone, not just the richest Americans, but really, rich Germans or Japanese banks or whatever else can buy them as well and it'll work the same way. The book has a little discussion of why I think, despite this, the interest tax exemption for municipal bonds is still a pretty attractive idea in some respects. And this turns on one of the big concerns of the book, which we call contagion, which is the idea is that if one jurisdiction faces a fiscal crisis, will it affect lending in another? So when Detroit faces a crisis, will people no longer lend to Milwaukee? And by the way, there's some evidence this occurs normally, but the American system is and by the way, it's very clear it happens at the international level, that when Mexico had a fiscal crisis, suddenly Brazil couldn't borrow, even though Mexico and Brazil don't trade very much with one another, nor do they speak the same language. And so these contagion problems are very real at the international level. The American system is designed to reduce contagion. And this is because, broadly speaking, if you imagine who's likely to react badly to a default in Detroit, and I'm not going to lend to Grosse Pointe or whatever, it's going to be people who are foreign from the place. So whether they're from Japan or from Maine. And our system is designed to have investors be extremely local. And the reason they're very local is because not only do you get an income exemption on federal taxes, you also get on state taxes. So who buys New York bonds? It's almost exclusively New York people. And they are less likely to react to a crisis in another place because they are local high information investors. This is to be treated. The benefit of this has to be traded off against the benefit of having a broader purchaser for bonds, which is like giving the same type of benefits to an investment by a Japanese bank as we do to a local resident. So that's who buys the bond. The answer is largely people in state and largely the highest income taxpayers in the state.
Thank you. Yeah, in the back.
Professor Schleicher mentioned that Utah is this AAA rating, and I was just curious, what is Utah doing to be so much better than other states, and what can Wisconsin do?
It's a great question. I actually don't know what Wisconsin's bond rating is. I should have checked before I got here. I think it's quite good actually. But it's there are a bunch of states. Utah is not alone. I just choose Utah because it's they're like that. Like they're frequently used as the example for like doing everything extremely squarely. But Virginia, for instance, has a AAA rating as well. Other jurisdictions not so much. And so what do they do? It largely does look a lot like these good governance system things, which are that they do have an extremely transparent system. They do all the things it turns out their budgeting system is works for a whole variety of state local reasons, isn't super contentious in the same way that you see here. You talk about the three things, infinity and then contested values. Well, if you happen to live in a place where the values are less contested, you're less likely to have conflict across these things. But it's a lot of this is a little bit, so it's a little mysterious in some ways. So Virginia, for instance, is kind of a lot like states nearby. Utah is different in a lot of respects from a lot of its neighbors, politically and otherwise. But Virginia has managed to maintain this very, very, very pristine budget going forward, despite being, purple politically, and despite being very contested. So it is what makes politics work well is like a multivalent thing. It's that way. But so again, I don't think there's one situation. I mean, I will say that all things told, a contested political high turnout, all the things that we might associate with a kind of a healthy politics are correlated with a good budget process, but that's about that.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I mean, if there was a single indicator, you could look at a state local pension system and how adequately funded it is, because that's that's why states like Illinois, and I'll just say Illinois because that's
the same question. That's the question, right? So that's just saying why is your budget bad? Because your budget's bad. An underfunded pension system is itself debt, right? So but that doesn't answer the question of why you have an underfunded pension system, right? It's
poor decisions.
Yeah, well, but it's
Historically.
right. I mean, yeah, you could ask a similar question well, why do governments have made better and worse investments over time? Why do some places have better or worse infrastructure? Politics works in its ways it does, and so.
Okay, I think I stranded at least one question, but we're going to have a reception, so you can ask your question then. So please join me in thanking our speakers. That's great. Oh,
Hello?
yeah. Awesome.
Are you not?
Maybe not in second class.
Oh, interesting.
Could be my new thing.
I think very frequent thing.